Hi, so in this video, what I want to do is model a way of constructing your entire project, including looking at data sets, finding relevant literature, and beginning to plan your project proposal. So to get ready for this, I'd like you to open three things. Firstly, open your NVivo data set for all of the archive responses that we've gathered. And I'm going to be having a look at how we can begin to explore around this to find topics that are worth looking at. I'd also like you to have the website, the database Communication and Mass Media Complete open, because we're going to be using that to find relevant academic material. And then finally, have a blank Word document open, because we're going to use that to take some of the things we find over here and save them and then stick them in another NVivo document. So let's start off then with step one. So we're thinking about a topic that we might want to research, but we have to think about this professionally because you've got limited amounts of time available to you. And one of the things that we have available to all of us is this huge data set of diverse, about 150 responses to questions about the social effects of media. And we can use this is a really valuable resource to think about the complex ways in which contemporary media affect our social lives. So this is the sort of evidence that really gets used in social research. And it's a great opportunity to begin to see what we can do with this sort of qualitative data. And the professional applications of this are really, really useful. What you're doing here is not writing an essay, but doing a piece of research. So one of the things that we've got here is this rich source of data, which is also, of course, quite difficult to deal with because we have 170 responses and 170 different accounts of what people do with media. So the obvious question is, well, what can we do with this? Is it all about the same thing? Can we find any kind of central tendencies, or can we find any meaningful, interesting patterns of difference that probably tell us something about how media work in the social world? So there are two ways to begin to have a look through this. One of the things we could do, and it's a good thing to do, is simply start reading them. And using the coding function that I've talked about before. You recall in the self-assessment document that I sent to all of you that I showed you ways of coding some of these transcripts. Now, I don't want to share this in this tutorial because this tutorial does come via YouTube and therefore it's public. But you've seen in the self-assessment document how to go about making sense of some of these accounts, and you can follow that procedure using the node coding function that I showed you in the last video. I want to show you a different way of trying to kind of get around this, which is through the query function. So here's something that I did the other day. So another way of approaching this data set is to think about, well, what are the sorts of things that I might want to examine? And one of the things I did, I'll just show you how I did it. I was interested to know how many people remembered 9/11. So I'm just going to click over here, and I'm just going to put 9/11. So I've clicked on, so we're in query, I've hit text search, I've put 9/11. Then over here, I'm going to hit run query. Now, what you'll see is there are three different accounts of people who have remembered 9/11. So this is something that people talk about. An immediate question you might have is, well, can I really only talk about 3 case studies? The answer is yes, you can. The point is to try and think about what these 3 case studies tell us about how it is that 9/11 came to be an impactful, memorable moment for children. Of course, the interesting thing about you as a group, most of you are in your 20s, so most of you would have encountered this as children. So that's an interesting issue, isn't it? What does it mean to encounter a live act of terrorism on TV, or even, I know many of you didn't encounter it live, it was the news the next day, but what do these moments of terror mean to a child? That's a really important question, because these kinds of things are an increasingly common aspect of our screen. So in looking at these accounts, what you can do is you can kind of get an indication of some of the reasons why these moments matter to people. So this has gathered all of the accounts of 9/11, and obviously I want to save the results. And then what you'll see is that, maybe when I go through all of this, I'll figure out that I don't want to do something on 9/11. But if I do, it's right there. Okay. What you'll see is I've also done an earlier search on people who remember being scared by media. This is an interesting thing to look at as well. The question to which media invoke fear amongst people. And this, of course, some of you will remember that when we talk about media violence, one of the big questions is the role that media violence makes in making people fearful about the outside world. So that might be something else that we're interested in looking at as well. So we've done this and we've found a potential topic. I mean, something else we could do Twitter or Facebook or reality television, whatever, or perhaps we could do it by nation. We could do Malaysia or China. So the point is that this text query function is a way of making sense, is a way of kind of finding subsets within this data of things that we might want to research. Now, the next question, of course, is how can we, and then we're going to save that. So the next question is, well, how do we go about trying to join an existing scholarly conversation? So if there are people who remember 9/11, is there anything in the literature? What does the academic literature say about why 9/11 was such an important, significant media moment? Well, that's where we come to Communications and Mass Media Complete. So we're going to do a search for 9/11. So we put in 9/11 as a research term. And remember, we only want things that are in scholarly peer reviews because we want the best quality academic resources that we've got. Let's have a search. So what we find then are a range of articles about 9/11. So over here we find there's 844 sources. So what we need to do is we need to have a look through and think about which of these are going to kind of indicate why 9/11 was an important event. Now, for the purposes of this, I'm not going to go through everything. But for example, we might be interested in looking at anything which kind of indicates that this is something which had an effect on society in a particular way. So, for example, we've kind of got the idea that here, the march to militarism in Canada, domesticating the global enemy in the post 9/11 neoliberal nation. So we've kind of got the idea that, for example, this was an event that was shaped the political history of Canada, for example. So let's say we have a look at that. Here we've got a connection to the Charlie Hebdo incident. So this might tell us something about the idea that, France's 9/11, the idea that 9/11 kind of became a media story that kind of shaped how people connected to future terrorism acts. So say add that for the sake of argument. Here we've got ideas of stereotyping, the idea that 9/11 was something which contributed to something that was already going on, the stereotyping of Arab Americans, so something that had an effect on the way that people were living their lives and treating each other. We might want to have a look at this. This is kind of interesting. We're calling the Ghosts of 9/11 convergent memorializing at the opening of the National 9/11 Memorial. So this is something which relates to the way that people have actually embraced memories of 9/11 in their own sort of cultural practices. Something similar down here. The 9/11 decade, social imaginary and healing virtual community fracture. So we've kind of got the idea that 9/11 had an effect on the way that people began communicating with each other. Now, you kind of go through this and you just go through this and just kind of have a look through it, all the things that you think are most interesting. That would obviously take you a long time, but I'm just going to compress that here because once you've done that, you want to go up here, folder. And what you see is everything that you've collected is here. So what we want to do is kind of have a closer look at this material and see if there's anything that we want to follow up. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit select all, and we want to export all of this into a format that we can use to begin our lit search. Now, there are various ways of doing this. It's particularly good if you use EndNote, and you can export to EndNote. But for now, because I want to import these resources to NVivo, I'm going to save this as a file. And I want standard field format. And you're left with this. So what you can see you've got here is you've got your titles, your abstracts, and also a link to where you can actually find the original, the whole article. And this is important, of course, because all of these resources you can access through the Monash website, a library website. I'm going to hit select all. I'm going to paste it into Word. Special. I'm going to do it like that, unformatted text. Then I'm going to save this. Then going to go back to NVivo. Going to open a new project. Going to call it 9/11 readings. Going to import the data. There we go. Then I'm going to start going through this and looking for key ideas in why 9/11 had such a major impact. So for example, down here, I'm going to add a memo, annotation. If we look at this section that I've got here, the thing that I've highlighted, we have this idea that 9/11 endures as an event that people not only think about, but use in their everyday lives because of the presence of mobile media. So we have this idea that the way that we interact with the memorials of 9/11, the way that we interact with 9/11, as something that's an ongoing cultural event. It isn't something that's over. It's a story that we still think about. And what this does is it establishes 9/11 as a moment of, the phrase here is perpetual trauma. So we've got here a kind of what we would call a sensitizing subject. So media and so what I want to do is say, well, I want to go off and read this and say, what does this mean? And then can we find anything in the archive accounts that explain what the roots of this trauma might be? So this establishes a research question. Why is it? Is there anything in the initial encounter with 9/11 that explains why it was such a traumatic incident? And again, one of the issues that we talked about in regard to 9/11 is the idea that for many of us who encountered it in Australia, this was actually something which was an incredibly disruptive moment, because it was something that was encountered during breakfast time when we're used to screens that are featuring kind of soft news, happy news stories, and suddenly we're confronted with something that's incredibly traumatic. So is this something that you might want to pursue? So I'm going to end this tutorial at this point, but this is an indication of how you can move from looking at the archive to defining a research question and finding supporting evidence for that. And then in the next tutorial, what I'm going to do is explain how we can relate all of these activities to the writing of your proposal.